The Albanian crew made one mistake. Not the mistake of refusing Roy DeMeo's tribute demand. That was a decision, and it was a rational one by every framework they had ever operated within. The mistake was believing that Roy DeMeo operated within the same framework they did. He did not. He had built something that existed outside of the logic that governed every other criminal organization operating in New York in the late 1970s. Outside of the logic of intimidation and counter-intimidation, of challenge and response, of blood and consequence and cycle. What he had built did not produce cycles. It produced terminations. The Albanian crew discovered this distinction not through analysis, but through the specific, irreversible experience of being on the receiving end of it. By the time the understanding was complete, the understanding was no longer useful to the people who had developed it. They were gone, not arrested, not hospitalized, not relocated to a safer territory where the reach of the DeMeo crew's organizational weight did not extend. Gone in the specific, total, permanent sense that the Gemini method produced. Gone in a way that left no body, no crime scene, no evidence that any event had taken place at all. Just absence. The organized, systematic, industrialized absence that Roy DeMeo had been producing for years by the time the Albanian crew's refusal reached him. This is the story of what happened between the refusal and the absence, and what that interval reveals about the specific nature of what Roy DeMeo had built in a back room of a Brooklyn bar, and why the Albanian crew's particular kind of courage, which was real and which had served them in every previous context they had encountered, was exactly the wrong kind of courage for the situation they had placed themselves in. The Albanian community that was establishing itself in Brooklyn and Queens in the late 1970s carried something with them that the existing criminal landscape had not encountered in quite the same form. It was not simply a willingness to engage in violence. Every criminal organization operating in New York at that time had a willingness to engage in violence. That was the baseline. What the Albanian crews brought was something older and more culturally embedded than anything the American mob had developed through its own decades of organizational evolution. The canon, the ancient Albanian code of law and conduct that had governed everything from property disputes to family honor through mechanisms that included blood feuds capable of sustaining themselves across generations. A code so deeply woven into the fabric of Albanian social life that its enforcement mechanisms were not experienced as exceptional, but as ordinary, as the natural and expected response to violations of specific social obligations. Men who grow up in communities where the obligation to respond to dishonor with force is culturally absolute are not the same as men who grow up in communities where violence is a business tool that some people choose to deploy. The psychology is different. The relationship to physical danger is different. The specific quality of fearlessness that the canon tradition produced was not performed. It was not cultivated as an organizational asset, the way criminal organizations sometimes cultivate the appearance of fearlessness as a way of communicating capability. It was genuine. It was the fearlessness of people for whom the threat of violence had been so thoroughly normalized across so many generations that its value as a deterrent had been reduced to nearly zero. This quality was an asset in the New York criminal environment, not a marginal asset, a decisive one. The other street organizations that the Albanian crews encountered in Brooklyn and Queens in this period operated on conventional intimidation logic. They communicated capability. They made the cost of resistance clear and legible and calculable. They created situations in which potential rivals and victims could run the numbers, assess that compliance was cheaper than conflict, and make the rational choice. The Albanian crews looked at that calculation and declined to make it. They responded to intimidation with counter-intimidation. They escalated where every prior organization had backed down. They held their positions against organizational pressure that had moved larger and more established operations to accommodation. This worked. It worked repeatedly and consistently enough that by the late 1970s, the Albanian criminal presence in parts of Brooklyn and Queens had established itself as a genuine territorial power. Not through size, not through the kind of formal organizational structure the Italian families had developed over decades. Through the specific combination of genuine capacity for violence and an absolute, culturally grounded refusal to treat the threat of violence as a reason to modify their behavior. Then Roy DeMeo's collector came for the tribute. Roy DeMeo had been constructing his operation since the early 1970s. The foundation was loan sharking, a business he had been running since his teenage years in Flatbush, refined and expanded through his relationship with Nino Gaggi and the structural resources of the Gambino family's organizational apparatus. The loan sharking was relatively clean in operational terms. Capital deployed, capital returned with interest, enforcement mechanisms rarely required because the DeMeo crew's reputation by the mid-1970s was sufficient to make explicit demonstrations of that enforcement infrequent. Then the car theft operation, which grew into one of the largest stolen vehicle enterprises in New York history, 4 to 7 vehicles per night at its peak. A distribution network that extended beyond New York, beyond the country, to buyers in Western Europe and the Middle East. Money at a scale that the loan sharking operation could not approach. Then the murders. The murders began, as murders and organized crime always begin, as enforcement mechanisms for the other businesses. A man who had borrowed and not repaid. A man who had seen too much and was developing a relationship with federal investigators. A partner who had stolen. Problems that had been assessed and found to have exactly one reliable solution. The solution was applied. The problems were resolved. And then, through a process of operational refinement that produced one of the most disturbing innovations in the history of American organized crime, the Gemini method. The specific systematic process that transformed the problem of human evidence into a logistical challenge with an established solution. Shoot, tell, stab, drain, dismember, dispose. A sequence developed, refined, practiced, and applied until the complexity had been absorbed into something closer to routine. Until a crew of men in the back apartment of a bar in Brooklyn could process a human being from living to disposed in a matter of hours without leaving a trace that law enforcement could follow, interpret, or use. By the time the Albanian crew's refusal reached Roy DeMeo, the Gemini method had been applied dozens of times. The crew that operated it had the specific efficiency of people who have performed the same complex physical task repeatedly until the complexity disappears. They did not approach what happened in that back apartment with dread or hesitation or the psychological friction of people doing something extreme. They approached it the way skilled tradespeople approach familiar work. With the focused, practiced attention of people who know exactly what the job requires and have done it enough times to know they can deliver. The tribute demand that preceded the refusal was not unusual. The DeMeo crew collected tribute from businesses, from street operators, from independent criminal enterprises that had the misfortune of operating in geography that the crew had established as their territory. The collection was backed by the crew's reputation, which was backed by the Gemini method, which meant that in most cases the collection conversation was brief and the outcome was predictable. The Albanian crew's territory overlapped with geography the DeMeo crew considered theirs. The specific income streams being targeted are not fully detailed in the public record. What is fully detailed is the response when the targeting was refused. Before we go further, the Albanian crews eventually did establish themselves as a legitimate power in New York organized crime. The Rudaj organization. Federal prosecutors called them the Sixth Family. Some people argue they earned that title. Some people argue they were given it too easily. Drop your take in the comments. Did the Albanians ever truly match the Italian families at their peak? Or is the Sixth Family label just a story that sounds better than the reality? We'll be back to that question at the end. Right now, back to 1979 and the conversation that Roy DeMeo's collector brought back. What DeMeo knew about the Albanian crew that the Albanian crew did not fully know about DeMeo is the asymmetry that determined everything. The Albanian crew knew his reputation. They had done what people in their position do when they assess a potential adversary. They had gathered information. They had heard the stories. They understood that the DeMeo crew was dangerous, that it operated with Gambino family sanction and resources, that its standing in the New York criminal hierarchy was substantial. They had assessed the visible portion of what they were dealing with and made their calculation. The calculation was incomplete, because the most operationally significant thing about Roy DeMeo was not visible. The Gemini method was not described in any public document during the DeMeo crew's active period. Law enforcement knew something was wrong. The pattern of disappearances was impossible to miss entirely. But the specific mechanism by which people were being made to disappear had not yet been reconstructed with the completeness that would come years later, from the testimony of crew members who eventually cooperated with federal prosecutors and provided the accumulated account that assembled the full picture. The Albanian crew's assessment of their risk, therefore, contained a fundamental gap. They had assessed the visible threat. They had not assessed the invisible one. And the invisible one was the only one that mattered. The Albanian tradition of blood feud and violent response assumes a specific thing about how violence operates in the world. It assumes that violence produces consequences that can be addressed through counter-violence, that the cycle runs forward indefinitely, that capability and will are what determine how it eventually resolves. This assumption is the foundation of the specific fearlessness the canon tradition produces. It is the assumption that makes refusal a rational position. You refuse. They respond. You counter-respond. The cycle continues until one party exhausts their capacity or their will. If your capacity and your will are sufficient, you can sustain the cycle. And if you can sustain it, you can win. The Gemini method operated outside this assumption entirely. It did not produce a cycle. It produced determination. There was no body to discover, no crime scene to process, no evidence that an event had taken place that could serve as the foundation for a counter-response. The Albanian crew's capacity for violent response was not relevant because there was nothing to respond to. There was simply absence. Total, permanent, organized. You cannot sustain a blood feud with an organization that leaves no blood. The fearlessness that had been the Albanian crew's greatest organizational asset, the genuine, culturally embedded, canon-formed fearlessness that had allowed them to refuse every previous intimidation and hold their position against every previous pressure, was not applicable to the specific operational reality they were now inside. Their entire framework assumed a cycle. The DeMeo crew had built something that skipped the cycle entirely and went straight to the end. The mechanics of what happened are reconstructed from testimony, not from any single cooperating witness, but from the accumulated picture that multiple accounts, produced over years of federal prosecution, assembled into a coherent narrative of how the DeMeo crew operated when presented with organizational problems that required the established solution. The approach was not direct confrontation. It was never direct confrontation. This is one of the consistent operational facts about how the DeMeo crew applied the Gemini method across its full history. They did not challenge targets in environments where the target's own capabilities could be brought to bear. They created situations in which targets were separated from their organizational context and placed in circumstances where they had no reason to be operating at maximum alertness. The mechanism was plausibility, an invitation, a suggestion that the tribute dispute could be revisited, that the first conversation had been preliminary, that the refusal had been noted, and that a modified arrangement was potentially available, that both parties had an interest in reaching an accommodation that didn't require escalation. Criminal organizations do negotiate. Tribute arrangements are adjusted. Initial refusals do sometimes lead to modified demands that both parties can accommodate. The Albanian crew, operating from the framework of their own organizational history, had no particular reason to interpret an invitation to continue the conversation as anything other than what it appeared to be. They came to the conversation. What happened in or near the Gemini Lounge's operational geography that evening is not reconstructed in the public record with the granularity that would make a precise account possible. What is reconstructed is the method, the sequence, the specific systematic process that the DeMeo crew applied with the efficiency of routine. The approach, the execution, the apartment, the bathtub, the plastic sheeting, the bags, the Fountain Avenue dump, or its operational equivalent depending on the specific decisions of that evening. Before morning, it was complete. The members of the Albanian crew who had refused Roy DeMeo's collector were in the process of being disposed of through the established protocols. Before morning, they were gone. Not arrested, not in a hospital, not relocated. Gone in the specific total permanent sense that the Gemini method was designed to produce. The Albanian community in Brooklyn and Queens registered the disappearance the way tight communities always register the disappearance of their members, not through official channels. Through the organic information network of people who know each other, who know who was present on Tuesday and who was not present on Wednesday, who understand when the absence of someone who has been present every day is not an absence that will be explained by anything the official information channels are going to provide. The specific completeness of the community's understanding of what had happened, how quickly it developed, and what conclusions were drawn from it is not documented in any public record. What is documented is the outcome. The territory that the Albanian crew had been operating in underwent a complete and rapid change of organizational character. The operations that had been generating the income that DeMeo's collector had come for were now generating that income in a different direction. The tribute demand that had been refused was not represented. It did not need to be. The disappearance had communicated what a representation would have said, and it had communicated it more completely and more permanently than any second conversation could have achieved. This is the specific mechanism by which the Gemini method achieved its organizational objectives, not primarily through the direct elimination of the immediate threat. Through the communication that the elimination made to every organization operating in the relevant geography, through the quality of the absence that had no body, no crime scene, no official record, no narrative that could be disputed, reframed, or used as the foundation for a counter-response. Just absence, and the conclusions that absence was designed to produce. The DeMeo crew did not need to send another collector. They did not need to communicate anything explicitly to anyone. The territory managed itself. The tributary relationships established themselves. The boundary between what DeMeo controlled and what other organizations could operate in was redrawn in ways that reflected, precisely and completely, the demonstration that had been made before morning. The broader Albanian criminal presence in New York was not eliminated by what happened before morning. The specific crew that had refused was gone. The community they had operated within remained. The organizational capacity that the Albanian criminal world was building in New York during this period was not dismantled by the loss of one crew. What changed was the specific geography, and the specific understanding, communicated through absence rather than words, of what the operational reality of refusing Roy DeMeo's organization actually was. The Albanian challenge to Italian mob dominance in New York eventually succeeded. The Rudaj organization and its designation as the sixth family by federal law enforcement is a documented historical fact. The Albanian criminal presence in New York eventually developed the organizational depth, the resources, the institutional relationships, and the operational capability to contest Italian mob territorial claims directly and to win those contests. But that development came after Roy DeMeo was dead. After the Gambino family had been systematically dismantled by the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s and the cooperation of Sammy Gravano. After the institutional strength that had backed DeMeo's tribute collection network had been reduced to a fraction of its previous capacity. After the specific organizational infrastructure that made the Gemini method possible had been exposed, prosecuted, and imprisoned. The Albanian challenge to the Italian mob succeeded in conditions that were radically different from the conditions that had existed when a specific Albanian crew refused Roy DeMeo's collector in the late 1970s. In those conditions, in the specific operational environment that existed before morning, the refusal had produced one outcome. One complete, permanent, irreversible outcome. The DeMeo crew's operational period ended with the federal prosecutions that produced life sentences for Joseph Testa and Anthony Sinner and the accumulated accounting of what the crew had done across a decade of continuous operation. The 100 to 200 murders. The Fountain Avenue dump and its contents. The systematic application of the Gemini method across years of activity. The Albanian crew's disappearance was one entry in this accounting. Not the most numerically significant. Not the case that anchored any specific charge. Part of the pattern. The pattern was what the prosecution was built on. Not individual incidents, but the systematic character of the enterprise. The organizational structure. The consistent methodology. The deliberate operational design that had been maintained and refined across years of continuous application. The characterization of the DeMeo crew as the most violent crew ever prosecuted in federal court reflected this assessment. The most violent. In a body that had prosecuted organized violence across the country for decades. The Albanian crew that refused before morning was part of why that characterization was accurate. Their disappearance was not exceptional. It was